The RPG Maker General Podcast, or the rpgmgp, where insight is the essence of good content. Hello everyone, and welcome to a very special episode of the RPG Maker General Podcast, or the rpgmgp. I'm Cody, with me today is Carbonic.
Hey, it's me, Carbonic.
And today we have some very special guests. I'd like to welcome onto the podcast both Nikko and Justin, the developers of Glitched, which is currently a RPG Maker game on Kickstarter, which has become amazingly successful. It's actually completely funded about 3 or 4 times over. Gentlemen, go ahead and introduce yourselves.
Yeah, I'm Nikko. I'm one of the developers.
And I'm Justin. I'm another developer.
Can you tell us what Glitched is, what the game is about?
So we kind of marketed Glitch as a fourth wall-breaking, story-driven RPG, and it's about an unlikely hero who witnesses a glitch in the game and then becomes aware of you, the player. From that point on, you'll engage in conversation with the protagonist, Gus, as you two kind of figure out how to save the world, but also what his role as a video game character is and how that relates to you as the player. And it combines turn-based combat and a lot of exploration and satire and just kind of fun little jokes and secrets to explore.
Okay, so I was wondering a little thing about the glitches in the game. Are they going to be involved in the gameplay of the game, or are they just going to be a story matter?
Right, so you're going to see it take place in both. It's going to pretty much drive the entire story, but we also have some plans to incorporate it into some of the mechanics. And one of the questions we know we're always going to be getting from people, and it's been pretty funny and a struggle, is that is this glitch intentional, or is it an actual glitch? And I think we're going to take that question and play with it with the mechanics of the game, and we'll get some interesting results with that.
It's not a bug, it's a feature.
Yeah, you can go full Bethesda on it.
Ooh.
Did you know that that's actually how the spy class in Team Fortress 2 came about?
Right.
Yeah, so with the original Team Fortress, there was a glitch involving changing teams, and sometimes you'd look like the enemy team, but then you would start shooting and you'd turn back into your team, and Valve decided, you know what, we could actually make that into a gameplay mechanic, and that's how the spy was created for Team Fortress 2.
That's interesting.
That is pretty interesting.
Yeah.
I think it was Team Fortress Classic, but So, how did you guys first meet up? How did you guys get to know each other?
We all moved to Chicago to go to university, and we all met in the dorms. And, we just became friends like any college kids in dorms become friends. We played League of Legends together. We, go out together. And then we moved in together our sophomore year. And that's where we sort of sat down. I originally had the beginnings of the game, and I was just on my laptop hanging out with it, and they popped in, saw it, and we began talking about it. And that's sort of where the beginnings of our friendship, but also the game started.
So you guys just kind of smoothly transitioned, like, you met each other, you became friends, saw the game, and then you all decided to rally around it and start building it up.
Yeah, I mean, Nikko had the idea originally, and in its early stages, it was very, very, very early stages. But we just have played so many games together. If it wasn't League of Legends or Super Smash Bros. Or talking about Final Fantasy or Pokemon or just all the different games that we've played, we started talking about, this was cool. Would have been cool if there was a game that did this. Or if, if this feature was done differently, or what kind of things would be interesting in a title that we would want. And we started talking so much about it and having so many plans that we realized, hey, what's stopping us from making our own game?
Right, and at that time, I was a game design student. Zach was a computer science student. So we definitely had the means to do it. And I think just meeting each other and realizing that, we could put our skills together and make something was the beginning. And just, being friends and having similar interests in RPGs. I think all of us are big RPG fans, and that pretty heavily weighed into how easily it was for us to sit down and talk about what we would do if we were going to start developing a game.
Yeah, it usually involves, usually game designers start out as friends. You don't often, or at least on the scale of independent developers, like yourselves, you usually don't find people who are like, they made a legal agreement and didn't know each other to become independent game devs.
Right.
Yeah, this was many years in the making.
Right.
What year was this?
This would have been our sophomore year when we originally started. We met our freshman year.
Yeah, so that was 2013 or 14?
2013.
13, yeah.
Awesome.
And we started just kind of storyboarding. We had a very small whiteboard that we would spend like late nights writing things down, coming up with characters, maps, different overarching story themes, mechanics and features, how we would do the combat, certain ways that the characters would interact, and it was all kind of based around the idea that Nikko had of having a character, or the main character, being able to talk to you, the player.
Right, and I think it's also important when we started, it was never serious in the beginning.
Mm-hmm.
It was just interesting to talk about it and like think about us making a game rather than actually concrete saying like, hey, let's do it. So it definitely started as like just a fun way to pass the time when we were bored, and it slowly turned more serious, but it started super lighthearted, super not serious, just us as friends talking about gameplay features we'd like to see.
Yeah. One of my favorite jokes that came out of that, and I did a lot of the music for the demo, and I'm going to do a lot of the music for the game, is I would show Nikko a song that I wrote, and he'd be like, oh, that's a cool song, but it'd only be good in a video game. And so I slowly, over the years, building a repertoire of different video game songwriting memes. Yeah.
Yeah, that's kind of how my web series Defeat the Darkness came about. Is I had an idea for like a video game, but a couple tropes get turned on their heads, and then my friend Adam came in, and we kind of hashed it out together. Because I'm more the process guy. Like I can make stuff work, but he's the one who makes stuff awesome.
Right.
And having someone to bounce ideas off of really helps, I think, especially when you're just an indie starting out.
Yeah, no, it's definitely a lot easier when there's a group to say, like, hey, here's an idea, and then watching it develop with 3 people working on it rather than just me.
Yeah.
Yeah. That definitely makes sense, because usually larger scale indie projects don't start out as, hey, we are going to make a game now and release it. They usually start as pet projects that evolve into something much bigger and greater than originally intended.
Yeah, I'd say that just about sums up Glitched.
Yeah. A lot of the times, especially in early development, we would think of certain things that would happen in some of our favorite RPGs and be like, you know, this isn't necessarily the most realistic way this would happen. And then we kind of played with that and tried to turn it into a little bit of a satirical exercise. So, like, in the demo, you can see the example where when you leave the town, you know, the town's like, hey, we've gathered all of these funds to give you, because it's, you know, you go, you're Link and you're about to go off to save the world, and you have to go to your local shop and, like, spend a bunch of rupees on, like, a sword or a shield or something.
Right, if I'm about to save the world, you should give me a sword.
Right. And so that like got bigger and bigger throughout the game.
Mm-hmm. I actually have a little question about the storyline of the game. Gus is the main character, right?
Right.
Yes.
Yeah. Is he a protagonist, like a main character in the game, or is he just an NPC who gains thought?
Right, so that's that is the big question, and I'll say yes to that, is that he was not the intended main character, and that trope will be played out, and the I don't know...
the bulk of what you will kind of explore as you go through that game is how does Gus end up in this position, and what does that mean regarding you, the player? It's a lot of the interaction between the two of you, but Gus was definitely not intended to be the hero.
Right.
I have a quick question for you. So, since he isn't intended to be the main character, obviously, as you get further in the game, there's villains, there's other things that are supposed to happen. Are the other characters that are supposed to react to the real main character, are they going to interact the same with Gus, or are they going to recognize that that's not who they're waiting for?
It depends.
Right, and I think you'll have we definitely have things planned where Gus is going to realize he's not the one who's supposed to be in this situation, and there'll be characters who, when they find Gus, they're going to say, hey, you aren't all that we thought you were going to be. You're something else. And that's going to kind of play with Gus's sort of this insecure, he's always very cautious when he goes about things, much unlike a typical RPG hero who's generally like, I'm brave, I'm leading the team, I'm always, following my dreams and my goals, like the typical hero with the big sword. And we'll play a lot in the fact that Gus isn't that.
Okay, here in the prophecy, Article 5, Section 1, it says a hero will stand tall, but you're only 5'8". I wasn't waiting for you.
How many pixels tall? And you can actually see some of that in the demo. If you get to some of the frog characters who interact with Gus, don't interact with him as they would if you were necessarily Conrad. They comment on that. Or some other protagonist who may have been destined to be. And that you'll see more of that in the full version.
Speaking of the demo, that will be down in the description along with the Kickstarter page to check out.
Yes.
When and what originally inspired you to make games? Was it ever since you were a kid and you played games that you wanted to make your own, or was this a much more recent thing that you got into?
Yeah, when I was really little, I had a Game Boy like many other kids. Mm-hmm. And I played Pokemon and I played that. I come from a pretty big family, so I have 5 siblings. And we were all gamers. And, we would do things like kids would do. We'd play with sticks in the backyards and pretend they're swords. And we'd play knights and all of that. And always through that, I was always sort of the dungeon master, if you want to call it that. I was making the world. I was saying, okay, I'm a dragon now, and you guys are this, and everyone kind of followed along. And I actually went to university as I started as a game design student. It wasn't really a fit for me. I wasn't getting what I wanted out of it. But I still had a huge interest in games. I've been a gamer all my life. And I think there was the struggle. Do I want to is it just a hobby? Do I just like games? Or do I want this to be a career or something I invest a lot of time into? And that has always been a question that I've dealt with. What do I want to do with it? And I think after this, I found my answer. But it's definitely been a long time coming to me.
I mean, I definitely kind of understand what you mean. There's definitely a weirdness to the way that, institutionalized video game design is done. From my experience, it's never been done in a way that really makes you want to make a game.
Right. I think after taking a couple courses, I was absolutely sick of it. And, there are some people who I think do really well in it. It just wasn't for me, and I think part of it was going to school for it made it feel like I wasn't enjoying it just because it was school, right? And maybe that's just me, but I didn't like going home and having to do an assignment that was game related because I didn't feel like I was, I wasn't motivated to do so, right? I didn't feel like I was doing it. I'm more of the creative type when it comes to development for Glitched. So maybe if I was more like Zach, a programmer, he might have got more out of it because he was learning practical skills, right? Where I wanted to learn more design and art, which is sort of I personally think you learn it by trial and error. You just need to practice it, do it yourself, see what works, right? And now there's definitely skills in university you can pick up that really help, programming, right?
Yeah, that's kind of like my brother loves cars. He loves working on cars. But he made it clear a long time ago that it could never be his job because then he would have to sit down and learn the ins and outs of everything to make it a proper career. He wants it to be his passion, so he works in a different field while working on cars in his spare time.
Right.
Yeah. I mean, the greatest thing about independent game design is working at your own pace. And even if you're a lone person making everything for a game, you can do what you want when you want. As in, if you're feeling like doing the music today, you can do that, or the graphics today, you can do that, rather than a job or at school where someone is telling you, you need to do this right now.
Right. And I think definitely with Glitched, it definitely happened at its own pace. And when we tried to speed it up or, set really, really hard deadlines in the early stages of development, it would always crash and burn because we needed to take the time to really think things out.
And have that creative space.
Right.
Since I'm here, The reason I wanted to start making games, I guess I came from the same kind of story as Nikko, being the dungeon master of sorts in my childhood games in the backyard and this, that, and the other. But I actually was really into a lot of different anime and JRPGs, and so my dream when I was in middle school was to learn Japanese, to move to Japan and make games, or more so write stories for games and game mechanics, because I was never a very good artist for video games. But I switched schools, and the school I switched to only offered Chinese. So now I've taken Chinese for 7 or 8 years, and I came to university as an international studies major because of that. But, you know, working, kind of meeting Nikko and Zach, and just kind of like being able to see my childhood dreams form into a real tangible project with Glitched kind of gave me that opening that I was always looking for. So it's interesting that we talked about how indie devs have the freedom to kind of do it at their own pace, at their own time. But even now that we're a Kickstarter funded company, we do have an obligation to get our project to the population, our fans and so forth, on like a timely basis. So it does limit that, but it's also still a labor of love for all of us, because we did get to nurture it to the stage that it is now.
I actually have a question in that vein. This happened with my web series. This clearly happened with Undertale. It may happen with you too. When you have someone making a game for the first or second time, the quality at the beginning starts kind of iffy, and then because they're still learning, it gets much better as you approach the end. And like with Undertale, it had very flat, basic backgrounds until you get to like the snowy town, and then the end places got more complicated. So are you guys at a point where you feel confident that what you have at the end of your game is going to be very similar to what you have at the beginning? You aren't going to have to go back and alter it much to match what you are now capable of by the time you finish.
Right. And I think those who have been following us for a very long time see the disaster that was our beginning art and see the art that's currently in the game now. And I think I am fairly confident that I can consistently, reproduce. Not only that, but I also have already begun to do that. That the art style will hopefully remain fairly consistent through the whole thing. Of course, I am, an artist, so I will be learning things throughout. The demo's going to get another, fix up and tune up. I constantly go back and change a little bit of the colors, do a little bit with shading. But I remember playing through Undertale and noticing like, oh, this has gotten a lot better. Like the art style almost felt different to me as the game went on, which I don't think is necessarily a bad effect. But I hope we can keep it consistent. But then again, I have no idea what I will learn or what I will change, so that's not a promise. But
I think also in terms of not just art, but game mechanics and story, having tried originally, and a lot of what we did with the first Kickstarter campaign, the first iteration, was figure out kind of the overarching story and the world, and we've been able to fill in some of the holes that were left from that since then. And I think we have a lot better, I guess, system or strategy around figuring out what the characters are, why they're there, what they're trying to do, and how that fits into everything else. And I feel like we've set the stage very well through our previous work for the full release of the game, both through trial and error and also just like learning. And we have like a baseline of what we're going to expect from ourselves for the release. So I think that'll help keep it somewhat consistent.
Awesome.
So your game so far, from what I've seen, is absolutely filled with many different, unique, quirky characters that are full of their own personalities. And I was just wondering, what is the whole process to create these characters?
Some of it's spontaneous. Some of it is we're like, oh, we need a character who can get this, our Gus or whoever else, from point A to point B, and there are plot points where we need to have like a functional entity to carry out, the story. But at the same time, there are a lot of times where Nikko will just be like, hey, so I think we're going to have a frog company. And then I'll be like, okay, we can have a frog company, but hey, how many frogs are in the company? And we'll do a little give and take as we watch the characters take the form of all three of our ideas and kind of turn into what they are. Because we do all have very interesting tastes in humor and like ideas about character design. So you will see some characters that are vastly different from one another in, the same map.
Right.
Oh, yeah, speaking of characters, I was wondering, is the game going to have a full-on villain, or is it going to be more of a story that doesn't really have a villain?
Right, so our hope in design is that there's not really a definitive villain. I think there's two sides to this. If you want to call the glitch the villain, you probably could, but we have some things planned that are going to make that a lot more difficult to discern things. In terms of actual characters, our hope is to never make someone who's just a big bad and they're just evil and that's it. Our hope is to at least always have two sides to the story, no matter what part of the game you're in. There's good and bad in each character, and you're going to have to make the moral decision, is what this character doing, in my eyes, good or bad, not just he's trying to destroy the world, so I have to kill him. Right. I hope we'd never put something like that in. And I think that's just a design point that we all sort of like. In a lot of RPGs, it comes down to there's someone trying to destroy the world, so we have to destroy them. And I think it works for a lot of cases, but we wanted to try something different, and hopefully we're able to portray those situations as more gray than black and white.
And I think that stems from what I was talking about earlier, where we were like, oh, we see these tropes or these things happen in RPGs, and we want to be like, oh no, that's not super realistic. What would it be like in a more real setting? And we've, looking at history or this, that, or the other, it's hard to say that someone or something is 100% evil. There are always motives or ideologies that go into it. Like Nikko said, we just want to portray those so the player kind of gets to decide. And then the fun thing is the player gets to decide, and then Gus is going to ask why you feel the way you do, and you get to have conversation about that.
Mm-hmm.
That's actually really interesting. So the way you're describing it, it doesn't sound like you're going to have what would be called like a karma meter or a Paragon Renegade system, because you don't want any decision to sound inherently good or inherently bad. It's just the decision you made at the time.
Right, and that plays heavily into our essence system, which kind of tracks a player's decisions. And we thought about, how do we track like a player's decisions or personality in a way that isn't and we started with like good and evil, and we were like, that's too binary, that's too black and white. And we experimented with different other things, and we settled upon our kind of like essence system, which tracks more the philosophy or the mentality behind why you make the decisions that you do make, and like how you view the decisions you make. You might want to kill someone if you choose to kill someone, and there might be 3 different reasons why you would kill them. Well, hopefully the essence system covers all of those 3 reasons and allows you to kind of build your own adventure in that way.
Okay, so the game isn't always going to punish you for not being a total pacifist.
No, there will be some hard decisions to make. There will be decisions where both are going to be difficult decisions, and our hope is there's never an evil decision, right? You might be able to kill someone, but can killing ever be justified? And maybe you'll find that answer.
Maybe Gus will ask you that question, and you'll get to talk about it.
Yeah. Because that was one of my problems with Undertale, was that it kind of trumpeted itself as this huge innovation in morality in video games, when really it was ultra black and white. Because none of the enemies were particularly bad, usually.
Yeah.
None of the people you face, they're just usually ultra cute things, and your choice is to brutally murder them or hug them.
Yeah, and I think that's something that they've really dropped the ball on with that system is, I don't think that, going full pacifist is my preferred type of game. There should be some sort of evil that makes you think hard about it. I really appreciate when a game tries to make you think. Like if you watch the anime Trigun, there's an enemy literally telling Vash to kill him because he will keep killing unless Vash kills him, and eventually Vash has to break his vow of not killing anyone to end this guy's reign of terror.
Yeah.
And we definitely are trying to recreate those types of situations in Glitched, and being a pacifist in some situations may, in your opinion, be best, whereas, you know, choosing violence in other situations may be the route that's kind of taken. I remember I was in a Twitch stream a few days ago, or earlier last week, and someone asked if there was like a pacifism or genocide route. And I think you have to tell me, I think that's like related to Undertale. My response was that it's a little more complex than that, because it's not really like you choose one or the other. It's you continuously make decisions which should have repercussions and consequences, which may limit the decisions you can make later in the game. But that's kind of what we're going for.
And I think just to go along with this, if people have played the demo, it will get dark. It will get darker. The demo's fairly lighthearted, but it's sitting on top of something fairly dark.
You asked if the game was hard, or if it would get harder or more difficult than in the demo, and I think not only in combat, and like kind of figuring out the mysteries and the quests and whatever puzzles we throw at you, but also it'll be difficult to make some of the decisions that you make, because hopefully we can generate like a feeling of camaraderie with the characters that you do side with, and like if you do something that causes someone harm, we hope that you'll feel that harm as well, in a strange way. So it will be difficult, just maybe not in a traditional sense of number crunching and min-maxing your stats sort of thing.
Can you give the people listening an example of what the essence system does? Can you think of an example situation where the essences would come into play?
So kind of one of the things we talked about when figuring out the essence system is, okay, let's say there is a house or a building that you're trying to get into, and there is a person inside the building. Now, every person is going to go about entering that house in a different way if the task or the quest at hand is to get and gain entry to the house. So someone who is Bastion, and Bastion is kind of like grounded, they're stalwart, adamant, unyielding, don't like change, that sort of thing, they might just keep banging their head against the door or keep pushing the door until it's completely blown away. Whereas someone who is Drift might walk around the house and kind of see what they can do, and they might notice that there's a window that's unlocked, and they might just slip in through the window because they kind of have that sort of luck. And then if you are Insight, you might say, okay, I can figure out what kind of lock that is. I can go home, I can research the lock, I can figure out how to break the lock, and then come back with the necessary tools to do so. And they're all about gaining that knowledge, where someone who's Conquest might be able to slick talk his way into the guy opening the door for him. Someone being able to kind of appeal to the person inside what they want and kind of promise to give them that whether or not they're going to or not. Or they might hire a specialist who's good at picking locks and use some of the funds that they've amassed over the course of the game to help them out, and that's Conquest. For Zeal, they might be able to convince Zeal is all about, it's Zeal, it's like Zealous, it's like the traditional anime protagonist, like, come on guys, you can do it, believe in yourselves, friendship is magic type thing. And they might be able to convince the person inside the door that they need to open the door because our cause is righteous. Our cause is the one that you should align with because it is the only cause. And that's what Zeal will try to do. Harmony is a lot more in tune with the balances. They might honestly just say, this door is locked and you're charged with defending it. And if I were to force you to break your oath to defend this house, I'd be messing with the balance or the natural flows of life, and it will come back to haunt me. It's kind of almost Buddhist in the idea that it focuses on the cyclical aspects of life and so forth. So they might literally just say, you know what, we're going to let it be. I'll find another option that's more in tune with what we need.
And I think for us, one of the big issues in the demo and going forward will be making sure that these 6 essences are all clear-cut and that they all make sense. And we have a couple of things planned to sort of teach a player without just describing each essence. We didn't do it perfectly in the demo, and we have, like I said, we're going to work on through playtest and through that, we're going to find better ways to make each of these they're kind of like personality tropes, if you want to say, a little bit more clear.
And one of the other things is we'll also show you how these person or essence manifests itself by some of the characters in the game. Like a lot of the characters will illustrate that they also, NPCs and such, they also align with a certain essence. So you'll see how they act, and then it'll help you understand what the essence embodies.
I'm really into that because one of my least favorite things is the idea of a greater good, or the idea of a character who is a greater good type character who always knows what's the best. It's really why Superman is one of my least favorite characters of all time, just because there's no flaws to that, and there's no even if he is like super strength and has no physical challenges, Superman never actually faces any moral challenges either. Like any real moral challenges.
Right.
Yeah.
With that essence system, I'm sorry I keep asking questions, but I'm really curious. So you're going to have a lot of gamers that will go for, challenge runs. You've probably heard of like the Nuzlocke run in Pokemon. There are people that try and go through with the Team of All Fire, that kind of stuff. Are you going to have ways to beat the game by going full Harmony or full Zeal, this kind of thing? Is there a way to beat... Are you planning on letting players beat the game, just trying to go through one path and one path only?
Yes, it'll be up to the player in that, and we are having to make some interesting design decisions because of this system, where there's not always 6 choices to something. There might be 3. And then it instead goes to your justification as to which essence you're going to gain from that decision. So sometimes there might only be 1 or like 2 choices. I have to do this or this. But then your justification will give you a certain essence. So a player will be able to play full Harmony, full Zeal. Sometimes, and what we have to do to make sure that players are clear of what choices are which without us completely giving it away, and that's just we have to work on making sure they're very clear and it's easy to see which ones are which.
Also, based on whichever essence Gus is, we'll give you a hint. Gus's hat changes color as your essence alignment switches. But that all based on your current essence alignment, you will also find that navigating certain situations will be easier for some essences and more difficult for others. So like someone whose Harmony might be able to resolve a conflict without going to violence before violence is even started, before you even enter the combat screen. Whereas someone whose Zeal or Bastion may have no business trying to do something like that. But they might shine in other areas where they need to get through a certain obstacle.
So whereas Harmony would look at a locked door and walk away, they would also be able to instinctually avoid conflict with someone who is being hostile.
Or even resolve conflict between 2 parties who are being hostile.
Right, and that's part of the design problems that we had earlier on is not only will you gain essence making decisions, but certain decisions will be blocked off or be changed based on your essence. So characters, you have your own essence, and NPCs will react to that as you're working on it throughout the whole game. And that's been part of the design struggle for us and making sure we can keep that balance and keep it together and it doesn't, fly off the rails. And I think we have a pretty good base to work on now to where we understand sort of the balance of it a little bit more.
It's a healthy challenge, I think, because it helps us make the game a lot more dynamic and interesting, but it is definitely something that we need to keep in mind during the development process, like constantly.
Yeah.
So, in general, what are your thoughts on the current status of indie games versus the AAA games industry? How we are sort of seeing this extreme popularity in much more classic-styled games in the independent group versus the industry and just what they're doing.
I actually think most people would give you a big thing on how the gaming industry's all messed up and all of this. I actually am one of the people that think it's fairly balanced today. I think there's a decent exposure for indie people trying to get into it. I think it's still difficult, and it always will be difficult simply because it's a creative field. And in any creative field, I would argue there's limited space for big successes, right? So not every indie game is going to be a big success. But I don't think every indie game needs to be a big success, and I don't think every indie game needs to compete necessarily with AAA. I think that there's actually becoming almost two markets that when I go into an indie game, I have different expectations than when I go into a big AAA game. And now the thing is that they are both games, so I'm still a gamer and I'm still experiencing them in the same ways. But I think when I play an indie game, just for an example, and there's a couple bugs or whatever, and, it doesn't play as smoothly, I don't mind as much. But, when I go get my big AAA release and it's filled with bugs and it's awful, I complain, right? So I think that the community does have different expectations on the two. I personally think it's fairly balanced today, but I know there still is a sort of big commotion about the indie-verse industry thing that I admittedly never put as much thought into until we got to where we were now. And now I'm sort of having to think, what are the repercussions of that for us as an upcoming, hopefully, studio?
Yeah. And there's actually a whole bunch of AAA developers who are jumping ship from the AAA industry and becoming independent studios again, just because in some ways being indie devs is more profitable than being a developer for a huge AAA company.
Also, I feel like we talked about like having creative freedom. I feel like when you are a big name company like Nintendo, people are going to expect certain things from you, and so it does somewhat limit what you can do in the field. Like, as a musician, I make a juxtaposition like the music industry. If you are like a pop star and you go off and make some avant-garde piece of music, people aren't going to like really accept it or really be appreciative of it. Whereas if you were to come from the indie field the indie field and maybe do that, you get a much different response. And I think that is appealing to some of the big name game devs who are there, yes, for the money, for the fame, but also because they love games and they love making games.
Right, but I think also what people forget is that the big AAA companies are there for a reason, because they can do quality assurance. And I think the best example that everyone's going to be talking about in recent times is Mighty Number 9. And what did we all get for him going indie is we got, the Mighty Number 2, right?
Yeah.
So I think, there's still, I don't think it'll ever go, where all these people are. I think the AAA are there for a reason, and we still get great games from AAA developers. I just think the landscape is changing a bit.
Mm-hmm. What you were saying about, I totally agree about the creative freedom. There's a lot of people where I'm pretty sure most people would rather have a work that they could call their own or could call their own story, rather than being the person who does the shading on gun textures.
Right. But would we ever have seen, would we have ever seen Skyrim if it was all indie? Right. I think we get the people who do just have to shade gun textures. I think, that sucks, but we would have never seen a game like Skyrim without that. Right.
And those, as someone who's now kind of in the gaming industry as well, there are jobs for people who are going to do really intense cell shading or shading graphics design and stuff like that, which you won't see if you're 2 or 3 people working in a living room
on a pixel game.
Yeah.
Yeah, I view it I view the AAA industry like I view Hollywood movies, where the budgets have gotten so inflated and the expectations have gone so high. They're too big to be allowed to fail. It's not too big to fail, it's too big to be allowed to fail. They have to be very safe. They have to make sure to capture as much audience as they can. And it's very, very constrained in what you can do. Whereas with an indie game, you're just doing it on your own time, on your own budget, and the expectations are much lower, and it allows you to experiment.
Right.
Yeah. Although we're kind of narrowing the focus on indie games in general. You'll notice that there's a huge amount, like specifically there's this channel called Harshly Critical, and he's a Let's Player, but he plays almost entirely plays independent horror games, which is full saturation, and he like completely trash talks them while he does it. So I think there's definitely still a whole bunch of criticism for certain parts of the indie scene.
No, right, and I think we definitely fall victim of it too. When there's a big indie sort of theme and trope that becomes popular, all the indies jump aboard, right? And I don't think it's for the same reason the AAAs constantly put out a Call of Duty, right? It's because you're following the success, which in any creative field, look at music, everyone follows the success, right? And I don't think it's a bad thing, but you do get that super heavy saturation, and then you, as gamers, not developers, as gamers you have to go through Steam, go through wherever, and wade through the crap to find the indie gems that you're looking for, right? Or just browse Reddit, and when the indie one comes high enough, you'll eventually see it.
And I think on the other side of that, it is unfortunate that there are some indie gems that never make it. Whereas, like, every game that's produced by a big company, you're going to see enough people are going to play that the word gets out if it's good, if it's bad, or whatever. Whereas there are several games that I might never hear, or you guys might never see or hear or play in your life, which are incredible, but they just didn't quite get the recognition because they were indie, which is a little unfortunate as well.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. That's actually a question I'm going to bring up later, because we had some questions from the RPG Maker General, which we'll get to at the end of this cast. In the meantime, so you're a three-man team. You all cover different aspects of it. One does the programming, one does kind of the story and art, the other does the music. How do you guys balance the workload? I know as my team is 95% me and 5% my partner, because I couldn't do it without him. I definitely couldn't. I need that 5%, but I'm the one handling the programming and recording and the directing, producing, getting the voice actors to do what they want. How do you guys keep each other satisfied with your work and keep each other in check?
Right. It's definitely been a learning process for us, like learning to work as a team. It didn't work for a lot of the times, because we've been at this for about,
For 3.5
years now. And it didn't always work, and there's definitely a learning curve on working as a team, and you don't really realize it until you're like, man, this hasn't been working at all. And I think what helped us start working well together is we just started checking each other. Mm-hmm. And when we started actually giving each other, like, honest feedback, we started actually working not for ourselves, but for the game. I think things worked a little better. And there's always overlap with work for us. Like, Zach does the programming, but I help him out with the programming. Justin does music, but I also lend my ear, and I'm also a musician myself, so I can help him. I do the art, but they both will say, hey, this looks good, this looks bad. Or, like, hey, can you draw it like this, or can you do something like that? I think when it comes to overall, mechanic design, we all have a pretty equal say on, how, we all write dialogue together pretty much. It's sort of like a group think when we get together and write dialogue. Sometimes I'll write dialogue, or Justin will write dialogue, and then we'll all go back and read it and fix it up and do that. So I think balancing the workload is definitely difficult when no one's like the designated leader. Mm-hmm. Figuring out how to start things can be difficult sometimes.
I feel like over time, as we do embrace kind of our roles or so forth, being a self-starter in certain areas happens more often. Like, Nikko will say, hey, here's this art piece. And then we're like, oh, geez, we got to write a story for that, which might, like, kickstart the next, like, focus of the game. Or if I'm like, hey, here's a song for what I thought about this area might be like, or for this character, then we'll be like, oh, yeah, I can get that because this song reminds me of this aspect of the character. And then we'll go and flesh out more about that character or that space. With Zach, it's really nice to have someone dedicated to programming, because we can come up with these great ideas, these great mechanics that we want to throw into the game, or different systems, and he can tell you how realistic those are. And then we get to work around how do we keep the core, like, aspects of those mechanics and systems that we like, but then also do we make them realistic and implement them? And also, like Nikko was saying, we check ourselves, and I think being able to set aside our egos and kind of be like, if Nikko writes some dialogue or I write some dialogue and I show it to everyone, or he shows it to everyone, or Zach shows it to everyone, us being able to say, oh, that's trash, we got to rip it to shreds and then start over. And the person being able to be like, you know what, you're right. This is pretty bad. Let's work from there.
And what a lot of people don't get is that there are bad ideas. Like, there are just bad ideas, and sometimes you will put forward a bad idea, and you just have to accept it's a bad idea. I think the whole thing that, like, oh, in the creative space, there's nothing, like, there's never a wrong decision to make. Like, there is. You can just write something that doesn't fit. And I think having 3 people is nice because there's always... and we also have to go about it to where I'm not like, Justin, this is a piece of shit, or I have to just make sure I'm saying it in a way that it's constructive and that like helps move us along. And being at this for 3.5 years, and 3.5 years for me, it's almost been 5 because I've taken the project I've been there since my sophomore year of high school. But we have to be able to say at this point what's good and what's bad, or we'll get nowhere. And that's why it's taken so long, is because we had to learn to work together. Mm-hmm. And that's a process just like game development.
Yeah, because it's all of your baby, and if you can help each other raise the baby, then you all benefit from it.
Exactly.
Right.
So, you guys made the demo, which is available now in RPG Maker MV. But you guys plan for the rest of the development of switching engines over to Game Maker Studio. Can you guys explain that choice?
Right. So initially, our plan was to raise $7,500 on Kickstarter, make the entire game in RPG Maker MV, and call it a day. And that's about what we were expecting was going to happen. We thought, we'd have some initial family and friends help boost us to get us a little boost, and then we'd have sort of the RPG Maker community, and people we had started following us on Twitter and stuff could help us reach the 7,500, and that would be it. And I think RPG Maker, a lot of people like to bash on it, but I think personally, one, it's a great way to just start, right? With a lot of the engines, there's a lot of pre-planning you have to do to get an RPG working, right? For someone with no programming skills, and you just want to start and see your things come to be playable, I think RPG Maker is great. But I also think MV specifically with JavaScript, having a programmer who knows JavaScript, lets you do a lot of additional things with RPG Maker that you wouldn't think you could do. But the switch to Game Maker came when it was time for us, once we passed our goals more than we ever thought we would, it was time to think about, okay, this will have to eventually become a project that we can bring to, the PS Vita, the PS3, PS4, Xbox One. And we were just sort of weighing the options between RPG Maker, Game Maker, Unity, building it ourselves. And RPG Maker was always in the running. It was never that we were going to completely ditch it. It just so happened that Game Maker fit our specific needs fairly well, and it could go to the platforms we eventually want to put it on. But the decision was definitely difficult because we're all fairly comfortable in RPG Maker and in Game Maker. Justin, not so much in Game Maker, but he'll learn the ropes.
I'm a quick learner.
Yeah, and I think that's one of the big decisions, is that choosing your engine is very important, and especially, I have an estimate on how long the hours are going to be for the total game time. An RPG Maker would have worked. I never want to say, we just left it because it's not a good engine. I think if it was just me, I would have never left RPG Maker, right? But when you have a team of 3 and you have someone dedicated to programming, it might be in your best interest to look to something like Game Maker as your next step.
Especially as we add in with some of our stretch goals a few features which aren't as readily available or easy to implement in RPG Maker. It kind of gives Zach more of his own creative space in terms of programming to implement those features in a way that works best with everything else that we are planning to have in Glitch.
Yeah, I've heard that a couple times about RPG Maker. Is it's excellent for a beginner. It gives you every tool you need to get started, but if you have sufficient programming knowledge, there are a couple things that limit it, and moving on to Game Maker or Unity or a more advanced engine, if you have the knowledge, would be in your interest.
Right, and I still think there's great games that have been made through RPG Maker. I know everyone will talk about like To the Moon or even Lisa as like pinnacle examples of Game Maker games not just being the copy-paste that you see a lot. So we would have never been able to do this without RPG Maker. I think it gave us a really, really good foundation and starting point that will always sort of be with us, and that pretty much let this happen. I don't think it would have happened otherwise.
Mm-hmm. Now you're going into the painful part where you have to remake everything that you've already made in Game Maker.
Yeah.
Yeah. So along those lines, we did some research on you guys, and we found your original Kickstarter from 2014. So it looks like you've made some changes to the staffing. Your art style has definitely changed, and your budget estimate has actually gone down from your original $10,000 down to $7,500. So I'd like to ask you, what has changed besides the art and the budget from 2014 to now? And how did you become so wildly successful this time around? Because I think you're at about almost 4 times your budget prediction now.
Yeah, I think so.
So I do want to point out quickly, as you brought up our old Kickstarter campaign, Nikko and I both bowed our heads in shame a little bit. But as you brought about recent events, we were able to hold our heads high.
And I think the initial Kickstarter was admittedly a rushed job, and it was us not knowing anything about anything at that point. And I think for us, we needed a failure because it taught us a lot, and it taught us not to rush. And you could go on Kickstarter right now, and you could go through and look at all of the games that are on there, and I think you'll see pretty much 2 types of Kickstarters. There's Kickstarters for games, and there's Kickstarters for ideas. And in some cases, if I am a big video game developer who everyone knows, it's okay to me to go to Kickstarter with an idea because I already have a long list of things I have done to prove that I can make games. But if I go to Kickstarter as someone like me, Justin, and Zach, a small little team with not much to show previously, we need to come with a game, not just with an idea. And I think that's the big separation between the two. Not only the quality, I think the quality increase from the last Kickstarter to this Kickstarter, and just the professionalism and the thought behind it all. I think we came to Kickstarter this time with a game rather than just an idea. And I think that's sort of the big, for indies going to Kickstarter, I think that's the big thing. If you're an indie person listening, trying to get your Kickstarter successful, come to Kickstarter with a game. You need to have something playable. You need to have some proof that you can do it. You need to have your mechanics fleshed out and easily readable. Don't just come with, I want to make a game about this. Here are some concept screenshots and like a 45-second trailer. No, you need to come with a game.
So the proof is in the pudding, and you brought a whole bowl.
Exactly.
We actually brought 3 bowls.
I actually have a question about Kickstarter. When you were going through a process of getting on Kickstarter, did Kickstarter ever ask for a picture of your ID?
No.
No, they actually did when dealing with the banking
Oh, with the
info.
banking stuff?
Yeah.
Because
But
that was something really awkward for me, because, like, I understand wanting, like, the social, because it's a pretty big investment, but the way that Kickstarter is, like, take a picture of your ID and upload it here is a bit, like, a little bit skeevy.
Yeah, and I think like with any crowdfunding platform today, there's like some skeezy things behind it. But for people like us, like I had to follow it just because there was no other way we were going to do this. And we sat and weighed out our options, you know? Like, do we have to go to Kickstarter was the big question for like a couple months. And eventually it came down to like we need money. Like we don't have a choice at this point.
Yeah. Well, they asked about lowering the budget. I think we also looked a little bit more realistically about what would be necessary to create the game. And we realized that, sure, it was going to be heads down, very, very long hours and very, like, tight budget if we were on $7,500. But that's what we thought was doable. And we wanted to be, like, transparent with the with the community. We didn't want to say, hey, we need $10,000 or $15,000 to make this game when we could make it for less.
Right, and just because we can make it on 7,500 doesn't mean it's not a super struggle for us. Like, we'd be working part-time at other jobs to pay rent. We'd be doing things like that. But that was my assumption, was the next year and a half was going to really suck for us. That development would just be rough. We'd be stretching every dollar. We'd be working, late nights. But we were willing to take that journey just because we, like you guys said, it is our baby.
It's like our dream.
Right. But now that we have a little bit more of a cushion, we're figuring out what's a good way to, use that cushion we have now to not only make development easier for ourselves, but to just make the product better.
Right.
Awesome.
Adding in new features, making the assets look better, getting just all around. There's a lot that we can do with the extra funds that will go back into making the game better.
Yeah, because I go on Kickstarter and I see, like, some of these people's stretch goals are very, very arbitrary. Like, $110,000 to get you a PS3 version and $140,000 to get you the Xbox 360 version. And it's like, why do you need $30,000 for that?
Right, and especially, we tried to make it, realistic stretch goals. Like, our first couple of stretch goals were just, they were $1,000. Right, so we had 7,500. I think our first one after that was 800 or 8,000. Sorry, we literally just needed the extra money for some extra assets. We pay artists, we pay a producer for the music, so we just straight up needed the money for that. And we actually put some time and thought into our stretch goals and what was the actual dollar amount, not just like an arbitrary decision like, oh, I guess at like 150K, if people care, we can put this. Right, and we tried to keep it all under 100K because we wanted everything to be realistic. We didn't want to shoot our, what's the point of even having a 250K stretch goal when we knew that would never happen?
Fair enough.
So there's been something that's tugging at my mind, and most likely a lot of people's minds. Gamers these days, I think particularly gamers who are into the indie field of games, are pretty cynical. And when they look at your game, they are probably only going to see its inspiration from games like Earthbound or possibly Undertale, and they might call it a possible ripoff. But I was wondering what you would say to those kind of people to assure them that your game is unique to those.
So this is sort of the big criticism where it is. We've gotten a fairly positive reception for it, but where there is the people bashing it, it always comes down to this. And we never tried to keep it a secret. Like, obviously my art's inspired from Earthbound. Obviously that's where it comes from. I think it does have my own flavor to it. I don't think anyone could argue you exactly ripped off this. But, we do take inspiration from it. And obviously, people will compare it to Undertale because Undertale found its roots in Earthbound, and that's where we found our roots. But I think one of the big distinctions, or one of the big things, is this is sort of how creative process works. And the demo, yes, I think the demo is a little too much grounded in the Undertale Earthbound. And you'll see in the full game we're going to make some changes that weren't really possible for us, simply because we're using RPG Maker, and RPG Maker does tend to fit you into a mold a little bit. And we're going to break away from that mold a bit. We have a lot of changes to some of the systems that are comparable. The art won't change much. So if people do say your art looks too much like Earthbound or too much like this is what the art's going to look like, and we're just going to have to deal with whatever backlash comes from that. And I guess the counter argument to that is how many army shooter games do we see a year that look pretty much exactly the same? Right. No one, and yes, everyone will say, oh, it's another Call of Duty. So I think there is, good criticism that we need to take in and actually absorb. And then there's garbage criticism. And I think for us, making the distinction between the two, there is, for everyone who releases anything ever, there's criticism, right? And I think as creators, we need to look at what criticism is right and what criticism is wrong, and what criticism can we take in to sort of help us make the game separate from everything else, while still saying, yes, it is inspired by this.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, my favorite, I guess, quote unquote, criticism or detractor I've ever dealt with is a guy who he just follows me around and he has a SoundCloud where he just makes SoundClouds where he's trash talking me. And he just follows me around on like 4chan and other sites and just posts various detracting statements.
And I think if we've learned anything from Donald Trump, it's that any press is good press. And, I think we sort of follow that philosophy where if someone wants to go and trash talk us on whatever form, that's great, because then if someone sees it, clicks on a link, and checks us out, they might like it, right? So, and there's definitely a balance to that. And I think, looking at the comments we've gotten so far, I thought it was going to be worse. I thought we were honestly going to get a lot more, criticism, just because, like you said, I think today the sort of feel for the gaming industry based on a lot of the stuff that's happened through Kickstarter and clone games, gamers have the right to be very cynical about these things. I think like after a lot of the Kickstarter failures, I've even feel pretty cynical about Kickstarter as someone who has a Kickstarter, right?
Are you saying
Trust
that we're
me.
living in a broken age?
I think that's a difficult question to answer.
Did you pick up on the reference?
Yes.
The Broken Age was a game made through Kickstarter that
And then it
people
completely
didn't like.
fall.
Yeah.
They used the entire budget on half the game. Like,
Right.
uh,
Yeah, I spent a lot of time looking over Kickstarters that either never came to fruition or like they released some garbage alpha that had like a tenth of the features. And I think it's rough when you see that. But then you also have to say Kickstarter brought us some really great games as well. So it's always a gamble. And when you're gambling on someone, on a small team, there always are things that can go wrong. And our hope was with a demo, with as much proof as we could provide that we can do this, that the people who are backing hopefully are fairly confident in us that we can actually do it.
Yeah, trust me, the criticism will get worse once you release it.
We know that.
We're prepared. But the hope is that some of the criticism will change, because we'll take some of the criticisms that, the positive or constructive criticism, and absorb that and change the game as is due based on what we believe is best. Like we've gotten some constructive criticism in private messages where people will literally try to tell me, Nikko, Zach, or all of us, you should change the game to be this way because of this flaw. And while we might agree with the flaw, we might not necessarily agree with how they want us to change the game, because it is kind of our project. We're going to make those final decisions ourselves. So it's a lot of filtering through the mess to figure out what's good and what's bad.
Mm-hmm. Overall, when can we expect to see Glitch being released?
My estimate I've been giving people is February 2018, and that seems very, very far away, but as we know from every other Kickstarter game that's ever been out, they never hit their initial deadline, and I don't want to say I can get it to you in a year when that doesn't seem quite as realistic. And my goal is maybe we'll shoot under that, and then that way we'll be known as the devs who made a game early, rather than we say, 1 year from now, and then it takes another 4 months, and then we're the devs who give you a game late. So February 18 is my official.
And we want to make sure that there's plenty of time for play testing, so there aren't any unnecessary glitches.
Yeah. Speaking of, you could just pull a Mighty Number 9 and just be like, constantly push it back and then release it and be like, it's better than nothing.
Better than nothing.
That's actually a smart thing to do. It's called under promise and over deliver. That actually happened when I worked in pizza. Is even if we were completely dead, we would say that the delivery time was about 45 minutes. Well, they've already bought the pizza, they've already accepted that they're going to wait 45 minutes, and then they get it about 25, 30 minutes later because they were our only order that hour, and we just got it out the door instantly. And,
Right.
and people were really excited about that because you beat their expectation. They already put in their money, they already accepted that this is what was going to happen, and then you made it better for them.
As developers who have ordered many a late night pizza, we can assure you that does bring great joy to our hearts.
Just that's the biggest goal in your life, or in everyone's life. To everyone listening, just set everyone's expectations of you very low, so that when you do anything, they're impressed.
Just glide through, man.
Yeah.
Just a real quick thing for you guys. If Glitched becomes successful when it's released, did you have plans for more games in the future? Do you have like a notepad full of stuff like I do for like, if only I weren't working on Defeat the Darkness right now, I could work on the Sons of Town?
Well, like we said kind of before when we were talking about our histories, this has kind of been a dream of all of ours on some level, to create games. So assuming Glitch is a success, we would like to continue making games as in-house studios. Now, whether or not we have a notepad with tons of ideas, there are definitely a few gems swirling around in the think space, but we can't quite tell you all about those just yet.
Right, and we don't want to give anything away about what would be the next project until it's time to actually say, hey, we did it, let's make a next project. But there are things we would like to continue doing.
Oh, wonderful. With that, Carb, we should probably go towards the fan questions and then do the tips and tricks at the end.
Yeah, so these are questions that we asked a couple people, or we asked the group that this podcast is based on, rpgmg, if they had any questions that they would like to ask during this podcast. Cody, why don't you start that out?
Okay, something that you guys have touched on a little bit, and I wanted to extrapolate on a bit more, is the first question was tips/guidelines for marketing promotion. And I think this ties back into your Kickstarter because you were much more successful this time around. And I believe, Justin, when we spoke yesterday, you said that you laid the groundwork in place. You had a Twitter and a Tumblr. You were connecting with fans. Is that the best way to do it, is to just build a base organically?
Right, I think as an indie dev group that's small like this, you have no other option. Right, you need to be on social media. And I think part of it is, one, you need to be able to look at your own work and say, is this good enough? And you constantly need to be evaluating yourself and making sure what you're putting out there is quality. And you need to accept, like, when it's not good enough, where can you improve? And that was if you look back at our old Kickstarter art, obviously there was room for improvement, right? And I had to actually take that in and sit down and learn how to pixel art, learn how to actually develop this. Once you have that, if you're at that stage where it looks good, you need to start on Twitter, start early, start on Tumblr. We actually had our first big break where we got to people. It was on Tumblr. I posted, it was very early on, this might have been 8 months ago. I posted sort of a summary of what I was doing. I had a couple images of the game, a couple screenshots, some concept art, if you want to call it that. And, it got a bunch of notes, a bunch of people started following me, and it happened in a day for that, right? And then after that, the followers sort of trickled in over the months, and I would constantly talk with Justin, we would do some math, right? If we could pull 10% of our followers to fund us, what number would we be at, right? It's a constant evaluation, and I think today, more than ever, it's a social media game. And if you aren't doing that, it's going to be a real struggle in the beginning trying to, especially if you open up a Kickstarter with zero social media. I don't think today you can do that, right? I think you need to have some people initially there to get the word out, right?
And it's also to build kind of the dedication amongst your fans and your community as well. Nikko and I were talking one time about how cool it was before Super Smash Bros. Brawl came out, where they would release some of the new characters and what their moves were and some of the new items, and it'd be a weekly update thing that would give people something to look forward, and it built hype about the game and showed that the developers were dedicated to the project, and it showed that they were willing to also respond to the community's desires and so forth, and get critique and edit things. So I think not only did we just get the numbers on social media, but we were also able to cultivate camaraderie, devotion, that sort of thing. Not devotion, that's a strong word, but you know what I'm saying.
Right, and a little bit goes a long way, right? Even 100 followers will help you exponentially more than 0. Because how that all works is more people retweet it, it just will grow exponentially, right? So even if you have a little, it can still go a long way.
So you don't have to be completely shameless. You just have to just keep posting stuff.
I think that's part of it. I think honestly, being shameless isn't awful. I think it will help you. Like, I showed a lot of my early development work, right? And I was okay with people looking at my early pixel art. I was on Reddit a lot, on the pixel art subreddit. And you could probably go dig through and find really old pixel art that I did that's awful. And the comments are all saying, wow, this looks completely off. Here are some things you could do better, right? And it was almost a 2-year process of me learning that. But even when people see the garbage art, sometimes I gained a follower, right? And that might have been back when I thought 10 followers was the world to me, right? And then just through that, people like to follow things, right? That's why Twitter's such a big deal. So I think if you're someone trying to get into it, start early, try to go at least one post a week somewhere. We eventually moved to daily almost posts. Mm-hmm. I think on average we probably posted every 2 days for the last couple months.
Wow. Because
I think it's important. It's how you should do it for people who have no background in it.
You have to build notoriety somehow.
Right.
And if you do it yourself through your own social media, you get to manipulate what that notoriety is, if it's good or if it's bad, or somewhere in between.
So you want to have a presence on Twitter, so that way you can talk about your game. You don't have other people talking about your game for you. You're already there and can promote it yourself.
Right, and then that way when something happens, if a screenshot's posted somewhere, people have like a call to action. We see it now with us. People will post our Twitter link all over the web now. And so there's a place for them to go to, right? There's something for them to do rather than just, oh, here's a cool screenshot. I'm moving on to whatever's the next thing. Right?
And it's actually fun and interesting to see now that we are getting some more success and fame that people are taking matters into our own hands. We've had a couple fans make a Reddit thread or subreddit for us or a wiki page for us. And then other fans are going to those locations to, add their own 2 cents or their own support or this, that, or the other. So it's really fun for us in that regard.
Oh, nice. Long story short, don't be afraid of your baby. Be proud. Get on Twitter.
And if your baby is ugly, the world will let you know.
Okay, so here's another question. And this is sort of similar to the other one, which was how do you keep up the workload, but how do you kind of stay motivated in a way? Like, how do you not feel like garbage when it comes to making stuff?
It's an interesting process or give and take, because there are definitely times in development, especially when you're reaching deadlines and this, that, and the other, where it does feel just like a lot of work and you're really tired. But like we've said, it's been a lot of our dreams on some level, and I think at least for me, it's kind of validation from fans, from community, from friends and family who see the project and are amazed or startled by how much work we've put into it. It is super rewarding to know that someone cares about what you're doing, and that if you put in that much extra work, then it's going to be that much more important to them.
Right, and I think if you want to look at points where we didn't have any of that, take right after our first initial Kickstarter that pretty much failed completely. There was a good, couple months where it just kind of died out. It was rough. We didn't really know what we were doing. We kind of stopped putting in the effort for it. And I think if you're ever having that moment where you don't think it's going to go well, it's not good enough, the fact might be that it's not good enough, right? That you need to actually sit down, reevaluate things. And I sort of had a big moment where I took the entire project and reevaluated, okay, is this good enough? And my answer was no, I could do it better. We could do it better. So we sat down, we relearned skills, we reevaluated what we needed to do, and then that's kind of when we started on social media. It's sort of right after that low point for us. We reevaluated everything, started on social media, sort of learned from the mistakes of the first Kickstarter to start building. And initially we weren't building towards a second Kickstarter. We were just building for the game, which I think also helped our success. Is I wasn't building to pitch something. I was just building it because I wanted to build it.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, you're not doing it for anyone else. You're doing it because you want to.
Right.
Here's a question that is a bit out of, or not completely out of the ordinary, but just a pretty different theme from the rest of the questions we've had. What is your all's favorite sci-fi movies?
Sci-fi movies?
Science fiction. That was an actual question in a thread, and I'm like, okay, we're gonna put it up.
I mean, there's a big one that everyone will obviously expect, but I will say, like, Star Wars was huge for me personally. It was kind of like, just like Lord of the Rings is huge for me, not so much because of the story or the specific character here or there, as much as it is the expansive world that comes with the Star Wars universe or galaxy, and the Lord of the Rings universe or galaxy. It's like just the attention to detail, and seeing, I'm an international studies student, so like seeing how the different processes work in this different realm of existence was really big and cool for me in Star Wars, because there was so much media available for you to get access to those different things. So Star Wars is a big one for me, and I love lightsabers.
Right, and Justin's like a big lore nerd, so when Justin gets into something, like you said movies, but Justin's played like every Star Wars video game, read every Star Wars book. He reads like Star Wars forums and all of that. So like when he gets into something, he knows every little bit of it. I'm not a huge sci-fi guy.
We watched Event Horizon.
Event Horizon that's a sci-fi movie.
Yeah.
I like that. That was a horror sci-fi though.
District 9 was a really
District
good
9 was
sci-fi movie. I think it's kind of gotten, a lot of people gave it praise, but I think it's kind of gotten brushed under the door, or whatever the saying is. But it plays out a lot of like the social implications of something like an extraterrestrial landing on Earth, and how that would play out, which I think a lot of sci-fi movies do, but I think given the location where it took place and the dynamics around that was really interesting.
And our final question isn't even a question. Someone just commented that your art and music were great, and when they were watching the trailer, it just made them so happy. So there you go.
Aww. Well, thank you.
Yeah,
and that makes us happy.
Yeah, we're smiling real big. Nico's dimples are showing.
How nice. Anyways, thanks for coming on.
Oh, no, yeah.
Thanks for both of you coming on. If you guys ever want to come back on the podcast for a more orthodox episode as just normal guests, you're welcome to come back on.
Awesome,
But
Yeah.
thanks for doing this.
Thank you guys.
Pleasure to have you. So that was Justin and Nikko from N-House Studios. This is Cody signing off of the RPG Maker General Podcast, or the rpgmgp. We'll see you all next time.
This is Carbonic saying goodbye.